Hello world, welcome to another episode of the Consulting Diaries. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. If you've been here before, thank you for joining once again as we talk all things consulting. Today, I'm going to be talking about the dark side of consulting, and I probably know what you're thinking. Why do you want to bite the hand that feeds you, Emmanuel? Well, I think I'd rather chew it off, right? But the point is to not be like negative, but the point is to just show the journey of what it's like to work in consulting, what to expect, what to fortify your mind against, because there are good sides and there are bad sides, right? Consulting is rewarding. I'm living proof. But if you don't consider the dark side, you won't have a thriving career in consulting. So here I am today talking about 10 things to consider in the dark side of consulting. Let's dive in. Before we dive in, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with everything Championship Mode Collective related. Now, there are 3 series in the YouTube channel: the Consulting Diaries, Reporting Live from the Gutter, and Staying in Championship Mode. So hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with everything Championship Mode Collective related. Alright, the dark side of consulting. I broke it up into 4 elements to be easily digestible: culture, performance, people, and consulting itself, right? So any of the dark sides that you experience will fall into one of the categories, and some things are general to like working and not necessarily consulting, but I apply them in a consulting context because that is my experience. The cool thing that I did with this episode is I asked a select group of people that have about 35 years worth of consulting experience together. So it's not just my 3 years, right? It's literally like 35 years of like consultants that have worked side by side, consultants that have led me in projects, consultants that I know as friends. So I think this will be really, really good. So let's dive into the first element: culture. 9 to 5 is a suggestion, right? Literally in consulting, it's long hours, and 9 to 5 is literally just like, what is that? Because we're very outcome based, right? So if there's a project that lands on our desk and we set the scope to be delivered on this time, you work according to that outcome, right? So if 9 to 5 is not cutting it, sometimes you work really late into the night, or you go home and you work late, or sometimes your weekend is taken. So 9 to 5 is a suggestion, especially with unrealistic timelines and long hours. Work-life balance is a myth. Anyone that starts the sentence with work-life balance, I automatically switch off. Never have I ever seen anyone achieve work-life balance. Before I was in consulting, outside of consulting, in consulting, work-life balance doesn't exist, right? I genuinely think it's a myth to get us to achieve, to aspire to something. But the cool thing is, consulting is a lifestyle, right? So you decide when you switch off or not. But the bad side or the downside is that there is no balance, and you sort of like have to figure out what that means for you. Toxic work culture and high corporate culture. Now, I struggle deciding whether to put this on the list, right? Because it is saying a lot. But unlike any other working industry, we literally experience a toxic culture, and we experience high corporate culture where you have to come in suit and ties. You know, it's all about perfectionism. It's all about how you come across to people, less alone your work, right? So consulting kind of like gives off that perfectionism, pretentiousness type of environment, and it doesn't help when the culture is toxic, right? What do we mean? Sometimes you have to sacrifice your time, you know, the long hours. Sometimes you have to fit to the bad culture. Sometimes you can't speak up. So you're just left with a culture that you have to deal with, and a culture that you have to sort of like navigate to get to the end of the project. And that sometimes can cost you your mental health, your sleep, and performance. Now, this one says a lot, right? Because it's more in your control, right? But you are only as good as your last project, Now, this is both good and bad, right? If your last project really went well, it means you have a high profile, people want you on their projects, right? But if your last project didn't go as great, or there was a negative perception that someone picked up, people will run with this. And when consideration comes for your next project, it's like, how did you do on this last project? Oh, let me speak to so-and-so's manager. And then they say X, Y, and Z. And sometimes you can get overlooked because people don't want to deal with that and they can find someone else. Now, COVID-19 has really stressed the workforce in terms of people resigning, the great resignation, as we've all termed it, but we don't want to do anything about it, right? Now, what the great resignation has done has meant that because there aren't people, we have to deal with the people that we have, and we have to put people on projects. So it's kind of like a bit balanced, because it's like, well, there's no one else to do it, so you might as well give me the opportunity. But yeah, you're only as good as your last project. Effort and reward ratios aren't balanced. Now, with some of the elements that I've mentioned, long hours, dealing with bad work culture, pushing above yourself to get things done, the effort that you put in, sometimes it's not worth it when you get to the end of the performance cycle and it's like, yeah, well, this is what we think we want to reward you, and then you consider everything that you've put in, including the sacrifices, right? So sometimes it's kind of tough. It's a bitter pill to swallow, and it hurts, right? I've been in that position where it's like, I don't think consulting is for me because the effort just didn't match the reward. But the other side is saying that, where are you in your consulting career and where can the investment be made? Because what corporates like to do is, when you're 4, 5, 6 years in, they're happy to invest in you because there's a good chance that you stay for the long term, right? So when you're up and coming, when you have 2, 3 years experience, it's really tough, because it's like, well, you want us to invest in you, but you might leave in 1 year or 18 months or 2 years, right? And people fall back to the more conservative position. Burnout is synonymous with high performance. I think this is my favorite, well, not my favorite, but this is the point that I really love the most, because consulting is really fast. It's all about high performance, how good you really are. And I have never come across a situation where the high performers in consulting don't suffer burnout in whatever form, right? Maybe you need a week after this hectic project ends, you fall sick along the project, you need a mental day off. The pressure really ramps up during a project, and to maintain that level of high performance is really tough, because there are also forces fighting against you, right? You have your personal life to figure out, you have the work, corporate culture to also navigate, and then you have the client. When you throw that into the mix, yeah, sometimes it's really tough. And especially if the client is not playing their part, it just stresses you more, and it kind of impact your ability to deliver the project and to sort of maintain that high performance. And I mean, I've seen people sort of fall sick, get put off projects temporarily. I mean, I had a moment where I was just like, I'm fed up. Can we just chill a bit? And literally my performance just started dipping. Not because I couldn't do anything about it, but it was just so overwhelming, right? And I've always been one of those people that has been like, I would never cry at work. Why would you cry at your job? Your job can be that stressful. Were there not tears in my eyes in May? Tears, proper. I was literally crying to my mates. And we were literally going through it at the same time. So we could really relate. But at the end of the day, it's all about that resilience and adaptability. Just taking the time off, feeling low, feeling the feels, and then just coming back to finish much stronger. So burnout and high performance, I've never seen those two separated in consulting. Moving on to the people side, your quality of work suffers and it's out of your hands, right? And this is due to a couple of reasons, right? Poor project management, poor organizational processes exist, so you just can't do your work to the best. Poorly scoped projects, that is literally the worst experience ever, because you're trying to deliver on deadlines that are not realistic, right? And sometimes you have multiple bosses on the same engagement and they like to do things differently, so you literally do the same thing like 2 or 3 times because you're trying to please both sides, right? And all of these things distract you from what you want to get at the end of the day, which is delivering for the client, delivering value for the client. So sometimes the quality of your work suffers and it's out of your hands. You are at the mercy of your leadership, right? So if this is like your engagement lead, your project manager, literally how they treat people and how they are as a person, you're literally at the mercy of their personality and their management style. So if they're a good person, then yay. If they're on the other side of the spectrum, sometimes it's really tough. Most of my time in consulting have been with really good, well-managed project managers, but speaking to my friends, speaking to people, hearing stories, it's not always the case, and sometimes you don't have that benefit where your project leader just looks out for you and creates a positive environment. Finally, consulting. Now, this element is the most difficult one to deal with, right? Because it's literally part and parcel of being in consulting. You can't change it, right? But like the culture, performance people, you can manage, you can navigate, but the consulting elements, it's really tough, right? So for example, think about the first one. Consulting is generally a generalist space, right? And if you're looking for technical skills, it's not the first place, or it's not the easiest place to accumulate, because we're very business focused, business process oriented, focusing on the management of consulting, right? Focused on the management side of the business. And so if you want to go in terms of the technical, programming, robotics, process automation, a couple of other things like IoT implementation, cloud implementation, then unless it's a technical consulting space, general consulting doesn't give you that. And if you like that kind of stuff, it can be difficult to sort of grow your career in that space, because I've seen people come into consulting and their role was technologist, implementation, whatnot. But then as time moves on, they don't get those projects where they can learn the implementation, and sometimes the skills don't exist to learn from. So it's what am I doing, right? Because there's no one to teach me, so I have to teach myself. But like a friend of mine would say, it's the blind leading the blind here, right? So consulting can really be a generalist space, and it might not be for people who want that technical, hardcore kind of skills. Consulting is literally the epitome of capitalism. Now, just a bit of a backstory, right? Because consulting doesn't generally have a good rep, right? How that happened is because consulting is just ruthless, right? It's about the bottom line, pushing for profits, and how do we make that happen. So back in the day, what consultants used to do is they used to go into a business, and especially when it came to cutting costs, they'll be oh yeah, get rid of this department, get rid of this, get rid of people, and that people sustainable element was really missing. But now we're sort of moving away from that cutthroat side of consulting to be more sustainable, to be more endearing. So as opposed to saying get rid of a department, we'll be upskill them to do other things in the business so that you can have that human capital. So consulting is literally the epitome of capitalism. Now, for 3 reasons, right? You're trained to sell in consulting. Literally, it's about selling. When is the next project? And that literally determines your paycheck, right? If your team has projects, it means you guys are doing well, more money to your pockets, more bonuses, and right? Now, the other thing is that sometimes we push for the bottom line really hard, and that can lead to poorly scoped projects, or like putting people in spaces that they don't want to do because you have to deliver a project because you don't have the human capital. And so that just leads to a high staff turnover, right? Because you're sacrificing your staff. So yeah, consulting, that side of consulting, I also like very much dislike. And it's not like it's gonna change anytime soon, right? Because like they'll tell you, we're here to run a business, not a charity. But it doesn't mean you can't be ethical, or it doesn't mean you can't have empathy towards the people you hire, right? So that's sort of like, I think that's the worst side of consulting. One more bonus point to consider, and this is really sort of like the all about you as a consultant, is your career. Right now, because consulting is just such a high pressure, like free reign environment, your career can literally go from hot to cold really quickly, right? And this ties into the fact that you're only good as your last project. You can literally be booming one leg, and then in the next leg, your team doesn't get a project, and you're sitting on the bench doing business development, and nothing comes through, right? So consulting is really tricky like that, right? And it has its ups and downs. Sometimes your career is hot, you're going from strength to strength, and you get knocked back a bit, and sometimes you have to reconsider. Now, considering consulting as a whole, let's just recap on the dark side we've just discussed, right? Sometimes you just have to deal with a bad culture, or a culture that doesn't enable you. Sometimes performance is out of your hands. You have to deal with people that might be good for you, that might be bad for you. You just have to take it as it comes. And sometimes consulting is just what it is. It's a high pressure environment, and you can't get away from that. So, from my side, these are the things to consider if you want to maintain a career in consulting, or if you want to jump into consulting. Now, maybe I do make consulting sound scary. Consulting is a beast, right? There is no two ways about it. But if there's a will, it's possible to survive consulting. It is possible to sort of like enjoy consulting. Check out the next episode where I discuss how I survived consulting. Alternatively, check out how I maintained a balanced life, since consulting is a lifestyle. Till then, stay in championship mode.